Tainter actually lays out various explanations that people have put forward for collapse and what happens. Many of these would be familiar to you. He lists 11 things. And I have to say, as you look through this, we actually hit 9 out of 11 of these, the way that I counted. The United States of America. Depletion or cessation of vital resources, failure to establish a resource base, insurmountable catastrophe, something happens, insufficient response to circumstances, other complex societies intervening, intruders, class conflict, social dysfunction, mystical factors, which we're going to talk about in a second, chance concatenation of events. What is that? It's a so-called black swan event. You heard that term. The idea of a set of circumstances in which everything that could go wrong did go wrong within a short period of time that it's impossible to predict that you have so many things go wrong at the same time. But it happens. It does happen as a statistical factor. And then economic factors. You would have to think to yourself, which 9 of those 11 we actually meet? Number 8, where did that go? Maybe social dysfunction was supposed to be number 8. Do we have social dysfunction? Yeah, we kind of do. Do we have depletion or cessation of vital resources?
Yes.
You ever heard of peak oil theory? Yeah. As everything I read, I mean, peak oil theory in its blatant form is a bunch of hooey. We're not about to run out of oil. It's better to call it peak cheap oil theory. We have lots of oil. We do not have anymore lots of light sweet crude, which is what we refine. We have lots of heavy sour crude, which we do not have the refineries to. We could have them. It just costs a whole lot more to do that.
We the U.S. or we the world?
We the world. Peak oil theory says that in a certain year, at a certain point in the development of this cycle, we will consume more barrels of oil per year than there are left. And some people say we've already passed that point. Some people say it will very soon be upon us. And that does have to do with the reserves that people list. Saudi Arabia, none of those reserves has been audited. And in fact, people have refused to have their reserve estimates audited. That's peak oil theory. But it's not really peak oil, it's peak cheap oil. The typical explanations for, yes?
I was just surprised that economic factors are the very bottom of
All are the very last. I did want to say tonight, we're not going to talk so much about the economy in talking about collapse, because we could talk about that for hours and it could be a week-long seminar. I do know that what people say is that it's all too complicated, it's too complex, I know, and they bury their heads. I can't understand. They're talking about all these things. And it is complicated, it is complex, but I'm an amateur economist, and I've only been doing it since 2006, and I understand it. I mean, I think it's possible to understand, but I do know that the reaction that I very typically get is you know, derivatives and what is this about the robo-signers and why is that important and what is MERS and how is MERS going to affect my mortgage? And the old-fashioned typical explanations, you know, are resource depletion, falling agricultural yields, economic decline, political weakness, and moral decadence is especially in the Roman Empire. That was the great argument that, you know, the reason we're having so many problems is if people would just be like the old Romans, if they would hold the old values. We have to go back to the old ways. And if people would only hold that, and that's why our country has declined, is because people just have loose values. And then Jared Diamond, in his book, so and I would recommend that you read Collapse. I mean, the unique part of Jared Diamond is that he does talk about the ecological factors of collapse. So that his basic thesis does have to do with collapse is overpopulation relative to the practical carrying capacity of the environment. That's the big phrase, the carrying capacity of the environment. That when you get past that, I mean, you have stressed the environment to the point where it can't sustain 1 million people. It just can't do it. And then he gives examples, historical, you know, Easter Island and especially Greenland, right? And the Norse outpost in Greenland that collapsed because they sort of insisted on doing it the Viking way, even though it's a completely different environmental situation. And it, in the end, could not sustain that particular way of life. The so-called mystical explanations of collapse, or I would call symbolic explanations of collapse, have a very long history, which has to do with all the way back to Plato, which is back again to the concept of time. For ancient peoples in a solar, so the Neolithic world is a lunar world. The Iron Age, late Bronze Age revolution is a solar world, and that's what Plato is a part of. Is that time is cyclical, and that there is an immense and unique relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm. So in the same way, and this is the New Year's festival, in the ancient New Year's festival, New Year's means that the world is recreated, the entire world, every year on New Year's Day. Because in cyclical time, perfection, and this is in Plato, perfection is the beginning, is the archetype, is the Platonic world, the ideal. That is perfection. And we begin the new year with perfection. And as the cycle of time goes through, everything runs down until by the very end, it is completely exhausted. And then the New Year ceremony is how do you resurrect? You throw out the old and bring in the new. So Plato says, since all created things must decay, even the social order cannot last forever, but will decline. I like Spengler. This is Spengler in The Decline of the West.
What year?
Pardon?
What year is this?
Spengler would be in 1850, 1860. A culture is born in the moment when a great soul awakens out of the proto-spirituality of ever-childish humanity and detaches itself, a form from the formless, a bounded and mortal thing from the boundless and enduring. It blooms in the soil of an exactly definable landscape to which plant-wise it remains bound. It dies when this soul has actualized the full sum of its possibilities in the shape of peoples, languages, dogmas, arts, states, sciences, and reverts into the proto-soul. Isn't that great? Mm-hmm. So there's the idea, the mystical idea, or the symbolic idea, that in the beginning, a new idea, a new concept, a new society, and this is part of American mythology too, isn't it? Is imbued with this spirit that is so strong and powerful, and it's the soul of the nation itself. This is the boundless, energy of Whitman. I'm very, Whitman standing on the docks of New York, 1840, looking at the world coming to New York City and the ships. Right? Sail, sail thy best, ship of democracy. Of value is thy freight. 'Tis not the present only, the past is also stored in thee. Thou holdest not the venture of thyself alone, not of the western continent alone. Earth's resume entire rest on thy keel, O ship, this day by thy spar. With thee, time voyages in trust. The nations sink or swim with thee. Now that's the boundless spirit of America. Right? And the optimism in that. And it feels like we've lost the soul, doesn't it? We no longer feel that at all. We can't stand on those docks in New York and look now and feel that. And that's what Spengler was saying, is that the soul, the fire in the soul dies down. The dwindling powers rise. In the gray dawn of civilization, the fire of the soul dies down. So that's an explanation of collapse, that it's the natural cycle of all created things to decline, and it happens to people, and it happens to societies. Okay. So, Tainter's explanation of collapse, and if I had a printout to give you, this is what I would, but I don't. This is the main slide. In other words, to understand it sort of historically, economically, and anthropologically, it's the diminishing marginal returns to complexity. The 0 point of collapse in any culture has to do with it. He says, collapse is actually a rational economizing process. People prefer the collapse than continuing in the old way. That's when you're at the 0 point, which is about the marginal returns. In other words, a society reaches a state where the benefits available for a level of investment are no higher than those available for some lower level. Collapse comes when owning a house, having high-speed internet, when you add up, the mortgage, the Comcast, the Sprint bill, and what, $5,000 a month? And you don't really feel any better, or it's no much than having an apartment somewhere with no overhead and no maintenance. And what do I really need the phone? Why do I really need a cell phone? What am I getting out of it? And things like that. And you realize that cutting back, it's even preferable. Or that the level of complexity, the size of government, whether it's a local or town government in North Andover, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, when it's the complexity of holding all that together, the laws, the rules, the regulations, then it's like, if I didn't do any of that stuff, it would be better, right?
At least it wouldn't be worse.
Right, and it would cost less. And the 0 point of collapse, that's what it is that's what he says, is that it's an economizing decision. It's downsizing, in other words. And the downsizing seems preferable to upsizing.